Hello, welcome to the Sales Development Revolution video series. In this episode, we're going to discuss some great strategies for recruiting and retaining the right SDRs for your team.
Yeah, we know that every organization is different, and finding SDRs that are the right fit for your organization can always be a challenge.
Yeah, and not only is it difficult to find the right SDRs, but it's also an ongoing challenge to get those SDRs onboarded and driving the level of performance that an organization needs.
I couldn't agree more, AJ. And while it's often overlooked, the skills of recruiting, hiring, and onboarding new SDRs is essential for managers trying to grow their team or improve results.
True. To help get you the answers you need, we chatted with Mary Grothe, the CEO of Sales BQ, where they help build and improve hundreds of sales teams by combining behavioral intelligence with proven sales strategies.
Yeah, we cover a ton in this episode. Everything from the systems that you need in place before hiring SDRs and recruiting strategies as an underdog in a competitive market to the blueprint for a successful onboarding program.
I'm going to tell you guys something. This was actually one of my favorite interviews. We were able to dive into the details of so many different aspects of sales development. Loved it.
Why are we still talking? Let's start the show. Awesome. So to frame this conversation a bit, a lot of companies use the same traditional method to build out an SDR team as they did, 5 to 10 years ago. They hire and train some entry-level college grads. They have their career path focused on getting that closing role. And then they set them off and have them pound lists until they either pass or fail. Do you still think this is a reliable system for building an SDR team, or do you think that leaders need to adjust their approach?
I think the approach needs to be enhanced. That's a polite word, right? And I believe that some of the most successful SDR teams that we've had the privilege of either building or inheriting and working with have the infrastructure in place for a high-performing team with very well-defined career progression for those who are seeking it. We have found that by bringing in some screening tools on the front end to even evaluate this person's desire to be in a sales role and to truly measure their figure-it-out factor and their potential for being a strong hunter, meaning can they handle rejection? Do they have a need for approval? Having better screening on the front end will help increase the success rates of this person being able to progress down the road into sales. But the biggest area that we have found needs improvement is true direction for the team. So we're looking at bettering the profile on who we're bringing in to that scenario to make sure that they've got the longevity to succeed in a sales career, so they have more of that DNA of a salesperson that you can screen on the front end, even if they've never done sales. But bringing that on the front end, then having that defined, what does the career progression look like, where you'll be successful using this recruiting method of pulling straight out of school or the entry level is they have to know where they're going. And it's not just a blanket statement of, see what you can do in a year, and then we'll sit down and talk and see if there's room for you somewhere else if you want to progress. It's having a clearly written program with day by day in the first 30 days what's expected and those milestones progressing throughout, and actual goal achievement, meaning if you achieve A, B, C, and D, then you can progress. So giving more definition of what the actual progression looks like. And then, of course, ensuring that you back it and your management team and your trainers and whoever else you have supporting this amazing team, that they're holding their hand and ensuring that those are being hit and bringing in the measures for performance improvement if they're not. The fun asterisk that we always look at is some SDRs actually don't want to go into full cycle sales or outside sales. They want to stay in that role. So you've got to have that asterisk too. What happens if someone doesn't want to progress out of that role? And then you have to be, and maybe they're phenomenal, so you want to keep them in that role, but you've got to figure out what you're communicating as that graduation point, because if you have someone who wants to stay, it shouldn't be seen as a negative. So there's just so much that needs to be defined. If we had to pick one word, is define it. What is the SDR program? And there's so many areas within there that can be fine-tuned.
Yeah, I think that the big point to sort of that I took away from all of that is a lot of organizations have this base foundation that has existed for forever. There's the past, I want to say 10, 15 years even, there's been sort of that idea that someone on the front end, an SDR or whatever you want to call them, is booking meetings for a closing rep. And they're always college grads who have their first job out of college, and their progression is always to move into that AE role and then maybe a director or VP of sales somewhere. But that doesn't, that's a good base track to work off of, but like you said, it doesn't work for all companies, and it can't work for all companies. So how we sort of retool that infrastructure to make sure that in, I guess, the modern day, we're not only, like you mentioned, recruiting the right people, but then taking those well-recruited people and putting them on the right track, whatever it might be, and sort of how that's built out is what's really important. And sort of building that before you get the people is where I think a lot of organizations struggle. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you need to have that process built out and understood before you can actually put somebody in a seat. And that's where the issues arise.
Agreed.
Yeah. Do you think that, and how do you think that organizations, I guess, are working to remedy that? Do you think that they need to take that base track that I talked about and just ditch it and build something from scratch? Or can they really work with what kind of already exists and sort of retool it to the point where it works for them?
Well, we're not fans of ripping and replacing a program if they're getting results. Now, there's a difference between a completely non-performing program where you may need somebody to come in and say, there's a whole thing that needs to start over, but that's typically not the case. There's usually something in place that has a good baseline. It just needs to be reworked. And my favorite place to start is always in the metrics. So many people have opinions, but opinions are valuable, data is priceless, and getting into the metrics. And for anybody that is building an SDR program, or they have one and they're not sure where to go and they haven't been tracking, just start tracking immediately and look at all the leading and the lagging indicators, because you'll start to notice that there are trends that are yielding that non-performance. So when you can get to the root cause and work the right end of the problem, then you know where your starting point is to rework it. So ultimately, I would want to identify what part of the program is not producing the best results. Is it the quality of the candidate? And then define that even further. Are they just not a good hire? It's a first job out of college. Do they know how to show up on time? Are they constantly using excuses to leave earlier? They need to go walk their dog, or they don't feel like working before 10, or what is the case? What is it that's not working? We always want to look at that quality of the candidate. Is it just not the right MO? The right DNA? Are they have call reluctancy, their figured out factors low. So do we need to dissect that person, or do we think that we're working with great framework, but they're not effective? So do they need more training? Do they need better call scripts? There's so much to dissect in a non-performing SDR program to figure out what needs to be reworked. There are pieces, so there's always people or process. If you're trying to figure out what's not right, it's either people or it's process. You've got to dissect both of them. Once you figure out people-wise, if you have really great SDRs, but they're lacking on their effectiveness, they need better scripting, they can't get enough volume out, so you need to look at bringing in more automation. You need to better define who your total addressable market is and carving that into a target market. If you don't have any supplement for marketing, or that's not well defined and you don't have very clear top of funnel and how those are being fed to SDRs, or if they're completely outbound and you've got a different funnel for inbound, but all of that has to be defined. So the recommendation here is get into the numbers, get into the metrics, and actually identify what's causing the inefficiencies. Is it people or process?
Yeah. And when you mentioned metrics, are there a few that really stand out to you when you look at a program where you're like, I know that I have to look at these metrics in particular to determine whether or not it's an SDR problem or it's a process problem? And what are maybe some of them that people might think would be an indicator of a program success or failure, but might actually be detrimental to sort of look at?
Sure. So there's always leading indicators and lagging indicators. Leading would be activity and lagging is going to be results. And if you wanted to simplify it at the easiest level, I would look at number of outbound. So if that's email, LinkedIn connections, phone calls, but look at or mailing letters, again, whatever is part of their program, but looking at the volume of touches and looking at those on a daily basis. And the lagging indicator, the easiest lagging indicator here to look at is the SQLs, or number of appointments that are however you define that in your environment. But there's so much more in between that you can start looking at the conversion rates, like how many outbounds to get a conversation, or you're reaching a decision maker, or you're talking to an influencer that then gives you information to get to the next point, how many touches in between then until you're getting the yes to the conversation. So you can dissect at a very granular level to look at all of the different pieces between, hey, I did my outbound, to I got the meeting. But if you want a most simple approach, is number of outbound touch points per day versus how many appointments they are setting.
Okay. So yeah, really looking at like the volume and how much effort the person is putting in is a great indicator for, yes, this is a good fit for the role, but maybe on the lagging end, the results might not be there. So you know where to sort of work in different training and ways to improve upon that.
Yes, because you may see clearly that you have 5 out of 7 SDRs have around 500 outbounds per week and 5 appointments is a great benchmark. And then you have 2 SDRs that are struggling to get 50 outbounds per day, and they're maybe getting 1 to 2 appointments per week. Now that's a very easy example. You may have to dig a little bit further into dissecting it with a non-performing team, but typically when you start running these numbers and analyzing it, you'll see some trends and it'll be very clear.
So one thing I wanted to ask about, because I mean, you know, making these changes, if you do them too small, you know, it's not going to be enough. And so I think a lot of managers get scared on making these transformational changes without really knowing how to approach it. And so when someone is looking at, let's say they find some metrics and maybe they find some improvements that they can make on both the process side and the people side, how would you recommend somebody approaching that, and how should they view this in the long term? Should it be a 3-month thing? Should it be a 6-month thing? What do you think?
Let me make sure I understand your question correctly. So if they have acknowledged they have a problem, that it's not performing at the level that they want, are you talking about a time frame for recommending and implementing changes and how they would do that? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I think more along the lines of, you know, how these people would approach it, given a timeline in mind. Because I know that a lot of companies, you know, process improvement sounds easy to many. They say, oh, you know, I revolve out templates and I have one-on-ones with all my SDRs and figure out what they need. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about really making some sustainable change to these businesses.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. So because we really are talking about revamping the program, and you have to have buy-in. So that's one of the things that we focus on at Sales BQ. BQ is the behavioral quotient. It's behavioral intelligence. People aren't going to show up and do the work if they're not bought into it. So much goes into somebody's BQ. They could be brilliantly smart. They can have amazing emotional self-awareness and other EQ skills. But if they don't have the BQ, which is they are motivated, they are bought in, and they have chosen to do those actions, that's a conscious decision, and that environment isn't there, they're not going to do the work. So don't go into all this effort of revamping your SDR program and then leave out the buy-in from the people that actually have to execute on it. And so here's one of my favorite ways to create buy-in is to what we call observe and shadow. Interview your existing SDR. Sit down with them, get feedback outside the one-on-one. Let them know there's a revamping that's going to take place. Get valuable feedback from them. Ask them very targeted, specific questions. Get your data points from the people that are actually doing the work. Record their calls. We use a call recording software and we love it because you're able to listen back and to hear back. Again, was it people? Was it process? They're making a ton of outbound dials. Are they effective on that? But you can get some award-winning talk tracks from some of your SDRs that you didn't even know they're going off script. And you're like, dude, this is brilliant. We need to include this. So get the observe and shadow week done and accumulate information from the field. You'll also hear things that you say, and I wonder why you're not performing, right? But we're here to get buy-in from them. So document all of that. Once you've got it all documented, they start to get excited. People like when their management team is making an investment in them, whether it's time or money, but they're trying to make them more successful in their roles. So I wouldn't do all this behind the scenes and then roll out all these changes and have it be a surprise to the SDR team. I would get their feedback. and have them feel like they're contributing to version 2.0 or 3.0 of your program, then there's buy-in, and it creates excitement because they understand that you're working to revamp this, and they're curious and like, I wonder what changes that they're making, and is this going to help or hinder? And then when you have the rollout of the changes, I firmly believe that it needs to be a team event, and it needs to be part of recreating what that high-performing sales culture is in your company. It's pulling everybody together. It's getting the excitement built around here's what we're doing, and then there's a training component. So as part of the rollout of it is there's the training component to ensure that everybody is bought into the changes, they understand the changes, and they can execute on the changes. So here's 3 steps to doing that. One, with the buy-in, is the person who's rolling out the changes to the program need to use their own emotional self-awareness and look around the room and see who is loving the changes and who might be sitting there going, you've got to be kidding me. They want me to do what? And you can just see it on their face. You can see it in how they're acting, but you've got to get the buy-in. So you have to go around. You have to have I'm sensing some hesitation or concern. Talk to me right now. What about this doesn't seem right to you? Where are we? So you've got to get the buy-in. That's step number 1, because if people emotionally aren't bought into this thing, they're not going to do it. Step number 2 is you have to train them on how to do it. It's one thing to be like, great, okay, everyone good, and then you wonder why people aren't going and doing it, or they do it and they're screwing it up. So there has to be a training component. So we're depending on how much you've trained, if you've brought in new technology or automation or enablement, if you have changed the structure of the cadence of how they're doing their outreaches. If you've brought in something new and different and not sure, in a group setting, you need to train, and you need to give everybody a chance to actually execute and do it and sign off on the fact that they know what it is and they can execute on that. And then the long term is put milestones in place to measure the success of your program. Every time we revamp anything or bring in changes, we have to measure that, because if we don't hit the milestones that we set out to achieve, you've got to tweak it a little bit. You got to move it this way, bring in this, remove that. Maybe that didn't work, but set your milestones for the program. So initially when you asked the question, you said, is it 3 months, 6 months, what is it? I think that you have very granular 30, 60, 90-day milestones just to check in and ensure that everyone's bought in, they're doing it, and you're starting to see some measurable results. And then from there, you can continue to check in quarterly. That you may find, again, it's either people or it's process. If you have someone who's not bought in, or somebody that doesn't want to do the new program, or even though you brought in something new and amazing to make them incredible, they're still not doing it, they're probably not the right person to be in the role. So you also need to set criteria for what your evaluation criteria is to determine if someone should stay in a role or not.
Yeah, I think a lot of that really hinges on the transparency that you touched on between the managers and the SDRs, and making sure that, like you said, the buy-in is so important. And you might think it's the greatest idea in the world as a manager, and you're like, this is how we're going to get ourselves out of the hole and figure it all out. And then you roll it out and no one does it and no one cares, and it doesn't matter. So like, you've invested all of this time and effort and money into trying to fix something that in reality just can't be fixed. And I think a lot of that hinges on the manager and really understanding how to effectively communicate with SDRs and relay this information to them, but B, also just being a good manager in general. And that's like where I think a lot of programs tend to struggle. Something I've noticed is sales development as a whole is rolled up either under sales or under marketing. A lot of organizations tend to silo it, and the bridge between those two sort of departments is a good manager. What kind of, I guess, advice or tips would you have for an organization once they have the system set up and they feel like they're ready to sort of churn out results? How can they can find the right manager to sort of implement that?
Right. Oh boy. Yes. So this is it's a big, big gap. In some of the smaller companies that we've had a privilege of working with, they have SDRs that are reporting to the same sales manager that manages the outside sales team. And it's not very successful. If you have 2 or more SDRs, you should have an SDR manager, and it feels like a big expense. But if you're bringing in entry-level people, they need constant guidance. I won't use the word supervision.
That's exactly what I was thinking in my head.
They need an ally. they need a go-to. This is a really hard job, and somebody needs to be there that can manage this team. And by manage, they need to be motivating them. They need to be holding them accountable. They need to coach them in every coachable moment. They should be sitting on the floor, listening to calls. They should be scrubbing and looking at emails that are going out. They should be checking the daily metrics and ensuring that. And oftentimes this role is just not even placed. We've had some SDR teams, like you said, that report under marketing. I understand why, because it's top of funnel. And in fact, in one of our clients, we made that same recommendation to. Very, very capable marketing manager. In fact, he did a lovely job. We only had one SDR at the time, and we were just bringing in the program. And we were playing interim sales director. They didn't have a sales director. So we needed this person to have that manager. She was entry level, straight out of school. And he did a great job, but he was limited because he's never sold anything. And he's never done a sales call. So let's be brutally honest here of who we need in that role. You need somebody who can emulate success, somebody who can model it. When you look at what a true mentor looks like, this person needs to be proficient in doing those outbound calls. If you are going to segment out the SDR function, you need to put a leader in that position, and they have to be coached and managed on how to coach, motivate, and hold their team accountable. Additionally, this may be a high turnover role. So depending where recruiting responsibility falls within the organization, they might also want to be always recruiting and ensuring that they've got a pipeline full of candidates that can come in so that this engine doesn't lose a critical person. But this person needs to be developed. The SDR manager also has to be coached and mentored. And that is very difficult because if you look at the silo of how it's typically broken out in the organization, you will have like a sales director, and then underneath that is the outside sales team or account executives. If they're not outside sales or inside, but they're doing full cycle AE. And then you've got this SDR team. And so if you have this sales director above that the SDR manager can also report to, this person needs coaching and guidance, but they cannot be left alone. We find that companies are quick to invest in the actual seller themselves, the salesperson. There's endless funds sometimes, or maybe not endless, but continued funds every year for coaching and training because they know like if we give our reps more, we'll get more business. But what are you doing with that middle layer? The management layer, that's critical. But there's a lack of funds that are being allocated to the sales management level. So my recommendation is, one, yes, you need an SDR manager, and they need to be responsible for that team. 2 or more SDRs, they need their own manager. You will get, you could double the results that you're getting if these people get that round-the-clock TLC, and then they need mentorship too, and they need a program that's specific to managing. If the program that you have is entry-level out of school, this is a younger generation. They need different things than your other sellers do. So you've got to put time and energy into that function.
Completely agree. So to kind of go into what you said at the very end there about how, most of these hires are either college grads or younger people that are just entering into the sales world or just getting their feet wet with this. How should you approach attracting them? How should managers approach engaging them and then keeping them engaged even after they're onboarded, even after they're trained? Because you were totally right earlier that not everyone is going to be on board with the process, and not everyone's going to be 100% bought in. And so how do you keep people engaged and really in the game?
Right. Think about if you're pulling from school, what are they used to? They're used to discipline and structure.
Skips class.
Hey, that wasn't me. I attended all of my classes. I was a straight A student. Anyway, but you think about the learning environment that they're used to. They're used to a very structured learning environment. And so when you pull somebody in from school, well, you asked me about recruiting, so we'll get to that in a second. But when you pull them into the organization, they need that same type of structure. They haven't had another job yet where they've had to learn a different way. For their entire school age life, they've been learning in a classroom, in a chair, with a curriculum, in a syllabus, in a book, whether it's electronic or paper book. And then you put them into a role and you just throw them into potentially something that's a week worth of training and then here you go, you're unleashed. That's not how their brains are wired. That's not how they thrive. This is their first real professional job. You can't make it too foreign for them if you want them to be successful. So again, I'll get to recruiting in a second, but as far as onboarding and training, we have found great success with a very clear, like daily, down to the hour agenda, 30 days worth of training with milestones each week and quizzes, and they have to test, they have to role play, they have to show proficiency in using the technology and systems where you're actually grading and scoring them. That's the mentality they have. That's the world that they're coming from. And so help make that transition into the workforce easy. How do you recruit them? Well, unfortunately, in a lot of the major cities, like out here in Denver, we're competing against Slack and Zoom, and we've got a Google campus, and we have some really cool big name employers out here who use this as their strategy. So if you are not one of those names and you are a smaller company than that, you have to get super competitive and creative. It's not necessarily in the comp package. We'll talk about that in a second, but it's about the culture, the environment, and the career progression, including mentorship. So it's coming out of school now. So that you've got the last of the millennials that are in the workforce. Now you have this iGen generation coming in, or Gen Z, as you've heard it called. They are wanting a constant, immediate gratification feedback loop. They also want mentorship. They are not our parents' generation where they are even remotely okay with working the same position for 5 or 10 years in hopes of advancement. They want to work that position for 5 to 10 months and have advancement. They care about titles. They care about, they look at what those have done, that the people before them have done, even their parents, our parents, and they look at that and they say, I'm going to do that in a quarter of the time. That's ridiculous. I'm not wasting my whole life working for the man. Like, I'm going to build this up and prove everybody that I can do it super fast, and then they're going to go off and do their big ambitious things. And I love that about this generation. But you as the employer, you have to build an SDR program. So some of the fun things that our clients have done in their SDR programs is they bring them in 2 by 2. And they will narrow it down from a big candidate pool, and they make it very competitive to get the spot. And then they'll have like a graduating class. So they've built the program, and so they're branded as an actual name of a class, and each class has its own unique name. They get t-shirts. They get to come into this program with all the very cleared out training and milestones and that they're going to be able to achieve. And then when they get to graduate, when they graduate out of being that SDR, they go into one of 2 roles within the company. They go to one of 2 ways. And so it's very exciting and it's very competitive, and they know exactly where they want to go. Additionally, that they're looking for a very fun culture and work environment. So think about some of the best SDR floors that I've walked. They all have standing desks. They have music playing. They have people that get to play DJ and alternate, and they've got a huge whiteboard, and they've got TV dashboards of people's metrics, and they're leading their lagging indicators. They've got a giant bell they can ring when they're setting meetings. So just think about that super fun culture. And then their perks, it's not necessarily all just make a lot of money. They give PTO days. They give afternoons off. They have, if you can set your stretch goal of appointments by Thursday or Friday, like you can take, if you want, the rest of the week off, or you can stay and work and then hit your bonus kickers on above and beyond appointments. So giving that person the opportunity to choose between earning more money that week or getting some free time to go out and play. But it's just attracting what they actually want. They want to be in a work environment that they love, and they're craving mentorship. So identifying that's not their manager. That's either an internal or an external mentor that you're assigning this person, a coach that's going to help them through this pivotal first year of their career so that they can have that development to go to where they want to in their career.
I think a lot of the stuff that you had touched on earlier really materializes in sort of that aspect of like the transparency between the manager and the SDR, but just like between the company and the potential employees they have, and knowing like, what do you want to get out of this? And that's so lost on so many organizations right now, where it's like, we have a comp structure in place, or we have, office perks in place. And this is just what it is. And if you like this company more than another one, like come work for us. But if you work for someone else, like, okay, you clearly just like their perks more. But like really getting in the head of a potential employee and understanding what they want means that you're not only attracting the right people, like you had talked about before, but sort of to Grayson's point, you're keeping them for longer, because a lot of people will use the SDR role as a launching pad to go into some other aspect of the business or some closing role. But if you get the people that really enjoy the role and enjoy being at the company, then they're going to stick around for a lot longer. And that's like where I see personally, and where I'm sure you would agree, a lot of organizations finding value and having SDRs that last 2-3 years. They can really build up a repertoire of skills and help the organization from the ground level versus, a quick bang, here's a ton of ROI, let me move on to a different role, or even leave the company and start all over again.
Right. And you definitely don't want that, right? Having them leave the company, you just made a huge investment. And
right.
They're talented, you want to keep them. So something innovative that we were doing with one of our clients was creating a 2-year SDR program, and then it had 6-month tracks, if you will. So the first 6 months was just straight learning your role and becoming proficient in it and executing, and it was straight mentorship of ramping in the SDR role. If within that 6 months you hit certain milestones or metrics, you can enter into your first track, which is where the majority of your work week is still as SDR, but you get to start shadowing and learning another function in the company. And you do that 3 times. So the majority of your role, so it could be outside sales, it could be some sort of leadership role, it could be in customer success or marketing or another department or the product or service or technology, whatever it is. And then you go into the next track for 6 months. So in that period of 2 years, you have tried 3 different roles outside of being an SDR. And then you can pick, and you already have on-the-job training and proficiency and understanding. So you're making an educated decision. So this employer is making a really big investment in this person because they're carving out 5 to 10 hours a week for on-the-job shadowing and training in a different role and allowing them to do 2 roles side by side while still maintaining their main position. But then that employee says, like, I know where I want to go, and this has already been laid out and defined, and so there's a lower risk of losing a great employee.
Yeah. How do you sort of combat, and I know that I've heard of, organizations going on tracks like that before, but I also know there's a lot of companies that are very staunch, like, I want my SDR to be doing SDR stuff. I don't want them to be, quote unquote, wasting time learning about marketing or whatever other track they would do. How would you combat someone who throws that objection at you if, you're looking to help retool a company's SDR team?
Sure, I would ask them to have an open mind. I would challenge them on the success that they've had to this point with that mentality. And if they feel like with that mentality that they're getting the results that they want, then I'm fine with it. Potentially they have created the culture or set the precedence that you are straight SDR for however long the program is, if it's 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or whatnot, then we have a conversation. And if that's how they want to execute it, then you build the program around that. But I would ask for them to have an open mind to evaluate maybe there's other ways of going about this that could have better results. And like you said, now that more and more companies are developing these tracks and on-the-job learning for other roles, why do they not want to protect the investment that they've made in that hire? I mean, you'd ask me about recruiting. It is so hard to recruit talent out of school if you're in a market that has a lot of really big name companies, because they have millions of dollars that they are throwing at attracting talent and recruiting and job fairs. I mean, they have programs already built with the schools. The kids are coming in while they're still in school and doing internships, and they're already grooming them before they ever graduate. And a smaller company doesn't have resources like that or the ability to do that. So, I mean, it is very, very, very competitive. So if you are a smaller company, not one of those big ones, then you have to be willing to do what it takes to retain that great talent, or you will then turn around and lose them to one of those bigger employers, which is just, what a waste.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in my mind, I mean, to me, going back to your conversation about mentorship, I really feel that is a unique piece for smaller companies, because at scale, as companies get larger, their incentives become very materialistic and less about, what an individual person or an individual manager can offer. And so for managers who, may have transitioned from, pounding the phone or coming from maybe like another role, how should they think about, that one-on-one coaching time, or how should they think about influencing these new SDRs as they're, themselves trying to figure out how to manage them and make it successful?
Sure. Well, there's three types of motivation. There's extrinsics who are motivated by external reward, typically money. There are intrinsic who are intrinsically motivated. They feel just success from self-competition, from recognition. And then there's the altruistic person who altruism is hands of service. So any opportunity that they have to serve, that's where they feel fulfilled, which typically that person doesn't do very well in a sales role. And we see contrary to popular belief, extrinsic, that only equates for about 15% of top sales performers. It's really the intrinsics. About 85% of top sales performers are intrinsically motivated, which means they have the self-competition and they love the recognition. They want to see the stats and the rankings posted out. They want to hear that they're winning, that they're at the top. They want those call outs within team meetings. So that manager, okay, at scale, when you're looking to scale the growth, it is pretty difficult to have so much one-on-one and everything be so personalized. But at a minimum, where that SDR manager can contribute greatly to the success of that person is by fueling their motivators and fueling, because if we think about when we all know our personal why and why we get out of bed in the morning, when we know that and our manager knows that and the manager can motivate that person and coach that person to that success. So the extrinsic and extrinsically motivated SDR is going to focus more on hitting milestones because they have done the math. Every dial they make based on the conversion rates gets them X amount of dollars. If they can do that math and say, okay, if I'm getting paid on set appointments and then close deals and here's my total comp package, I know that if I have to do 500 dials to get X amount of appointments and this percentage closed, they can back into that per dial what they're making, right? And so that extrinsic is going to be motivated by that money potential and setting that, but getting into their bonus kickers and going over their appointments for the month or whatnot. But the manager needs to feed into that. So any sort of coaching or communication or holding them accountable and in that day-to-day needs to be translated into the extrinsic language. But then also with the intrinsic rep who really isn't money motivated and they don't care. They're more about experience and how it feels, and it's about competition. And when you look at fueling that type of rep, it's the manager's responsibility to speak their language and create that environment. If at a minimum, without getting super detailed and creating something that can't be scaled, if the managers are trained on these interpersonal skills to make sure that they are being excellent communicators and motivating those two different motivational types in their team, I think that they can have a huge leg up and advantage.
Totally agree. And this really speaks to my mind on getting to know the people that you're training and the people that you're managing and leading, and building, professional relationships with them and knowing how to get them going, knowing how to level them up. Love that.
Yeah, I feel like there's always sort of like the 3 layers, I guess I would call it. When you're like building a foundation for an organization, you want like the infrastructure, like we talked about, the way that the whole sales team is set up in the sales development program. Like you need to get the infrastructure set up, then you need to find the right people, and then you need to effectively like train those people. But there's like that additional layer where I think a lot of companies sort of overlook, and what we just touched on is like making sure that the management is really like focused on all of that and it's bought in, and it seeps into the rest of the layers. But that's like the key component of making sure all of this works sustainably, is having that manager at the end, like Grayson had talked about, creating those personal relationships and making sure that like really everyone's happy and then everyone's performing at the level that they can.
Yes.
Awesome, guys. Well, Mary, this has been a really deep dive on the different components, from recruiting to onboarding all the way to the system. And I really enjoyed this. So is there a way that people can find you if they want to learn more about Sales BQ and then maybe learn, check you out?
Yes, please. You can connect with me directly on LinkedIn and Twitter. And LinkedIn, the profile is under Mary Grothy, and then the Twitter is Mary L. Grothy. And I also have marygrothy.com for all of my speaking engagements and one-to-one training workshops that I do across the world. And regardless, so we'd love to have a conversation in any way, shape, or form. Just reach out to us and connect. We'd love to have you in our community.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mary.
Thanks, Mary.
Bye.